Normally, the Patreon pitch goes here, but I have something a little more important to say. First, Louie and Fat Girl Ballet pledged this week, and I want to thank you both. But here's what I really want to say. I've had something on my heart, to borrow a traditionally Christian phrase. I think it's probably a safe bet to say that no matter where you are, no matter who you are, regardless of how closely you follow the day-to-day of American politics or atheist community drama and shadiness, that you've in one way or another felt the weight of current events on you. Maybe you're not directly hurt by what's going on, but you're hurting for people you love, or maybe you are someone in the direct firing line, but you've been feeling it. I know I have. Recent discourse around the outing of Lawrence Krauss as a sexual predator and recent revelations about some friends in our movement have shaken me pretty hard. The constant drumbeat of racism, sexism, xenophobia, and the general callous disregard for life and the quality of life in the public discourse in the United States has weighed really heavily on me these last few weeks. For lack of a better word, I'm an empath, and empathy specifically is the quality of sharing in the feelings of others. And empathy is often seen as sort of the height of achievement and quality peopling. And I'm going to be honest and say sometimes I don't fucking want it. It can be debilitating, but for better or worse, it's who I am. I get asked more and more frequently how I stay upbeat and positive and take care of myself in the midst of all of this. And the plain, honest, and brutally true answer is that sometimes I just fucking don't. I felt like giving up a lot lately. How many men I love and admire are going to turn out to be predators? How many more still will show up to defend them or dismiss the scope of the harm they do? I don't fucking know. So I've been thinking a lot about this question of how to navigate these situations. And frankly, I'm not in the state of mind at the moment to have any profound answers to these questions. So I'm just going to share with you what I've got on this. It's incomplete, insufficient, and maybe entirely wrong for you, and that's okay. Or it may be the right thing, but it's what I've got at the moment. And it's kindness. When shit feels super overwhelming to me, and it has lately, what I hold on to is kindness. I hold very tightly to my ability and capacity to share kindness with people who are hurting and who need it. And I remember and cherish all the times that I've been shown a particular kindness. And this is not going to be the thing that fixes the world. This is not some hippie kumbaya bullshit that all we need is love and love trumps hate. But what it can and does do for me is make things bearable enough to get through until the darkness passes and I can carry the fire again. Your source for news, commentary, discussion, and debate at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. This is the Atheist Manifesto. Hello, dear friends, and welcome to this episode of the Atheist Manifesto. I am your host, Callie Wright, joined once again by my fantabulous co-host, Ari Stillman. What's up, Ari?
What's going on? I don't know. I just showed up. A tornado took me. And now I'm here. That's a good
weird.
intro. Good intro. All right, Callie, go.
Yeah, you spent a lot of time preparing that one, I feel.
I did.
So
I'm on top of it this week.
So what does it mean to be a man, right? Our culture has plenty right. Obviously, neither Ari or I are those things. So our culture has plenty of answers to that topic. And as we know, frankly, many of them are pretty gross. And with all of this talk about toxic masculinity, I've been thinking on the question of what healthy masculinity might look like. And doing some research, I ran across an article about the work our guest this week has been doing, and he's been exploring just that question. Our guest this week is Dr. Michael Keeler. He is a masculine studies professor at the University of Calgary's Workland School of Education. God, I wish I had a title that long and cool. Welcome to the show, Dr. Keeler.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me on. And no, you probably don't wish you had a title that long.
Okay. All right. That's fair. Callie Wright, host of the Atheist Manifesto podcast. That's kind of, I don't know. But
I think that's super.
Awesome. I appreciate your affirmation. I needed that today. So let's start by talking for a minute just about what your work is about. What exactly do you do as a research professor of masculine studies?
Well, actually, my title is around masculinities studies in education, which reflects the plurality of masculinities. And my focus specifically is looking at how boys and men engage in being boys and men and what that looks like within the school system. And I mean, my new position here is unique in the sense that it's funded by a donor, which allows me to continue my research to address issues around boys and literacies, boys and homophobia, boys and body image issues. I've been writing and talking a lot recently about post #MeToo and #TimesUp and how do we engage men and boys in creating change. Those kinds of things are sort of at the core of my work on the day-to-day.
That's awesome. Is there a story behind your interest in this stuff? Is there a personal reason that got you into this, or is it just something that's interesting to you? Or
it's on the one hand, I mean, I think I was raised by a single parent, my mother, and she raised 4 boys. And so in some ways, people often look back to where do these interests come from, right? And I suspect being raised by a single woman who had to push back or push against patriarchy, I think that's probably the core, the root of it all. And I certainly saw how my mom, a lot of assumptions about her needing help and her not being able to do a lot of things that stereotypically would be associated with men doing those sorts of things. So I think that's probably at the core of it. And my interest in terms of equity issues and social justice have just sort of grown over the years. And, how I looked at other boys around me as an adolescent made me think about the different ways that boys can embrace masculinity and the ways in which we can reject particular forms of masculinity.
And so can you give me some specific examples of things that you study in this field, some specific concepts or questions that you explore?
Such as, for instance, what is a gender? I still don't know what it is.
Right.
I would be very grateful if you could help me figure out what the hell a gender is.
Well, I mean, I think our day to day, if we look around ourselves and look at the spectrum of the ways in which some boys and some men perform, and I talk about in my writing and in public talks about it is a performance. The ways in which we express masculinities is done purposefully. It's to either, in some cases, convince others of that we're either heterosexual or that we navigate heterosexuality in certain ways, or we're trying to convince others that we know the culture of machismo. We know stuff around football, and we know stuff around hockey, and in doing so, we get membership, right? So those kinds of things specifically actually connect to some of the research I was doing and have been doing around adolescent boys who don't like going to physical health and education classes. They withdraw from them because they're not interested in participating in those kinds of rules and norms of the locker room, where it's important to some boys to show that they have that kind of currency, that they know how to talk about football, that they know what's happening, they know all the hockey players, and they try to express or emphasize that. And in many ways, it's largely because of their own vulnerabilities, their own fears. And so they try to come across as an emphasized masculinity where they say, hey, I'm actually really good at football, or I'm really good at this. And in doing so, they put down other boys, and they make some boys feel less than men because they get they'll have their sexuality questioned, or aren't you a real man? Why don't you like sports? Those kinds of things. That's one sort of concrete way in which I'm looking at masculinities in the locker room and how homophobia gets brought up and people get positioned in the locker room because they don't show the other boys the same kinds of interests. And then the other work I've been doing too is around, for example, boys and literacy. So there's a lot of long history where boys typically do not sort of invest in school and schooling, and for young boys who take up schooling and are invested in it, and they read and they're actively contributing to school, they too can be positioned as less than, because other boys are saying schooling's for girls. It gets associated with the effeminate, and well, that's what girls do well at. And so there's a real long narrative around boys shouldn't be active in school in terms of academics, but boys should be active in school in terms of being on sports teams and those kinds of more aggressive kind of activities, whereas being intellectual and studying is associated with that's girls. Girls are smart. Boys aren't supposed to be smart. So there's these stereotypes, and those are just two sort of projects and examples. And I can go on. I've another one where I'm actually looking at how boys and men speak up and speak out, for example, against homophobia in team sport as well. And that's another third project I'm working on more recently.
Yeah, it just takes me back to school, like what you were saying about, academics and things like that, at the time, ostensibly as, someone everyone thought was a boy, I remember feeling that pressure. Like when the teacher would ask a question, I was afraid to raise my hand and give an answer because if you're one of the smart kids, like that's not a cool thing to be. And like, I had to be actively convinced, like, no, it's good to engage. It's good to learn. It's good to be the person in the group that knows the answer. And it makes me wonder, like, where a lot of this stuff comes from, because I think a lot of people will place it maybe on religion and our culture's sort of entanglement with religious history and patriarchy and what like traditional like mainstream religion has to say about gender roles. I tend to think maybe it's a little more complicated than that. I wonder if you have thoughts.
Well, I agree with you. I do think that there's a lot to be said about our cultural, North American cultural norms and understandings of being a man. And we all, I think, as you pointed out earlier, I mean, we all know what the rules are. There are particular rules and norms around femininity as well as masculinity. And so when in our current times, when I talk, for example, about much more fluid masculinities and fluid femininities, there's an uncertainty because all the traditional norms get challenged and people aren't sure, well, how am I supposed to be a real man? So in those cases, this is the current times, is that we're actually pushing back on the very restrictive kind of boxes that many of us have had to participate in for far too long, where we've not been true to ourselves, but we know what the rules are, we know how to participate in them, but we don't necessarily always agree with those rules and norms. So that's where a lot of tensions are for people like I was talking about the guys in the locker rooms who they eventually just withdraw from physical health education. They eventually also have long-term health impacts because of those dominant, aggressive boys who take over the locker room spaces, and they do so at the expense of other boys who, even though they like to have healthy lives, aren't able to participate in those spaces because, again, heteronormativity prevails in those spaces, and being a quote-unquote real man is what it's all about in some of those masculinized spaces.
Yeah, and I feel this so hard too because coming out as a trans woman, I felt the pressure to do the opposite and perform femininity. When I came out, it's like, oh gosh, I have to be really careful about the interests that I express, and I have to make sure I'm buying the pink things, and I have to make sure that I'm wearing dresses and buying all of my shoes from the women's section and that kind of stuff, and I think we talk a lot about that sort of pressure to perform gender when we're talking about trans issues, because I think that pressure goes a lot of different ways for people all across the gender spectrum, and I think maybe we don't give enough attention to those expectations on the masculine side, especially because I think. Maybe I'm overstating the case a little bit, but I think those expectations and those pressures on the masculine side of things tend to have more broadly negative effects in society. Like I have trans guy friends who talk about this pressure to be sexist. Their being accepted into their group of male friends is their male friends feeling comfortable telling sexist jokes and making sexist jokes around them and that kind of stuff. And the sort of pressure to participate in those kinds of things, to be accepted as who they are. And, not that trans women and trans femme folks don't experience things like that, but I think there's maybe more potential negative effect to society for those pressures. I wonder if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, definitely. And the way I think about that is historically, the narrative around masculinity has been in such a way that men have typically tried to build up barriers. Men have typically tried to protect themselves, and men have typically, and this is all very purposeful, actively convincing others about the real men that they are. They have, in their routine ways of talking about other guys or talking about women or about sports or so on, they've constantly had to try and prove themselves. And so there is a long narrative around that, which I would say that women have had to do that less. Women have less had to, not so much so prove to other people that they are women, but men have constantly had to try and prove that they're the right kind of man. And so going along with what you're saying, I think there's been much more work among men and within men to convince others and to prove a particularly heteronormative kind of masculinity. And in doing so, it's about staking a claim and creating territory and creating these silos that make men very rigid and restrictive in the ways that they present as men. And women have had, I would suggest, not such rigid barriers. And it's not to say that they aren't there. It is to say women have to present in certain ways. There's certain kinds of femininities. Some are more valued than others and more valorized than others. But I think in the broader North American culture, men do get positioned as doing certain kinds of work around their own gendered identity, which is to convince other people that they're the right kind of man.
I bet at this point in the conversation, we have some people listening going, oh, boo-hoo, poor men. It's so tough for you. This is reminding me of this video that I saw. It was actually by Turning Points USA, which is this awful right-wing, campus anti-PC group. And they did this video about
I've
boys
seen this.
in
It's
school.
so bad.
Oh, yeah, you've seen it.
It's so bad.
But it's not, because most of the research that they cite is actually true and is stuff that I learned in my developmental psych classes and in my psych of gender classes. But they take it to an extreme, like there's an assault on boys in school. Boys are falling behind. And it's, they take research like hyperactivity is often punished and aggressive play is punished and dodgeball is being banned, and certain types of academic fields favor women, you mentioned literacy, so verbal, foreign languages and English classes and those sorts of things, and art tend to be more female heavy, whereas the STEM tends to be more male heavy. So I was sitting there so torn, yes, most of this stuff is true and some of it is a problem, but you're taking it to this huge extreme where it's turning people off who would otherwise, like me, you know, people like me. I'm like, yes, I want boys to have a better time in school, but I don't like this extreme activist way that you're taking it. Not that I have anything against activism, of course, but I just don't agree with your end goal here.
No, and I would agree with you, and I don't want to come across as I don't participate in sort of the binary us them, women, girls, boys, men. I don't participate in, you know, one at the expense of the other. I mean, even the fact that we're talking about either or is a problem in itself, because I think, as you'd probably agree, it's not that simple. These are categories,
Yes.
These are binaries that have been set up, right? So who's constructing those categories and to what end, right? I mean, it goes back to who's more privileged by those categories to create the divisions. And so, you know, it's my research. It's not about, like you started off as saying, it's like the woe is me, poor boys sort of thing. I mean, that's exactly what I push back on, because it's not white middle-class boys, for example, who are doing poorly in school. If you look in universities and you look in schools, those white middle-class, largely heterosexual boys are performing well. They are the ones that their scores, their literacy achievement levels aren't the ones that are being raised in the general mainstream news. It's intersects more with race and socioeconomic backgrounds, and then you'll get like a more nuanced understanding of, okay, these are the young men, these are the boys who we should be supporting. So it's not all boys, and that often happens as Thank you. And this is exactly where I think the mainstream media and the general public sort of takes it up. Oh, we need to help the boys. We need to support them. That's not the case. Some boys, yes, but we need to be very careful about then diverting resources from where they're needed. And as you also mentioned, the idea that, yes, some women are doing better, but guess what? There's still a glass ceiling. And guess what? There's still white middle-class men who dominate the higher proportion of CEOs in companies. So things are not as good as one might hope they are. And so we need to continue to push back on these gendered stereotypes about the glass ceiling, about the culture, you know, around #MeToo and Time's Up. I mean, this is about a culture of complacency among men who have, refused to or don't know how to push back on a culture of masculinity where membership has its privileges. And for so many men, I would suggest this is an incredibly important time now to change the dialogue, to shift the dialogue where men can actually speak up and speak out against, sexual assault, and a culture in which it's been okay to turn an eye, because clearly we cannot go back to boys being boys and the way it has been.
I agree.
But then there'll be a bunch of cucks and soy boys, and nobody wants that.
Oh my God, Ari, I had a follow up to that, and you just totally threw me off track.
I'm the worst.
Yeah. One thing that I was thinking, as you were talking before, you were talking about how traditionally masculinity has been about building those barriers and sort of like separating yourself, saying like, I'm the one who is the real man and you're not. And I think that's where the importance of the conversation is, because I feel like some people might bristle at this kind of conversation because if you do it wrong, it can come across as like, oh, woe is me, the poor men. But what we're really talking about is how we address this power imbalance, right? Because the thing that we're trying to address at the end of the day is that, generally speaking, in society, masculinity is what's prized over femininity. And And you even see this in circles of women where they're, I'm not like the other girls. I'm just one of the guys. And like, that's the thing. That's how you communicate that you're one of the good ones, is you say like, well, I'm one of the guys. I don't have girlfriends. Most of my friends are guy friends. Like, you see that in circles of women as well. And I think that's a symbol of kind of what you were talking about, how masculinity is more prized. And that's where that power imbalance comes from. Am I on track there?
Yeah, no, very much so, and I agree with you. I mean, one thing I didn't say, I think it's important for us to. I mean, it's kind of, for me, it's kind of like a no-brainer. Gender is a relational concept, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Gender is about power, and I probably hadn't said that explicitly so far, but
Oh, that's what it is. Okay. I'm starting to understand a little bit more.
and so with my research, it's about how do we negotiate those power relations? What can we do to configure or reconfigure certain kinds of masculinities in a way that is engaging and allows for a new understanding or a different understanding of what it means to be a man? And these different contexts I've talked about with my research are sort of the places and spaces in which masculinities get played out, right? There's spaces in which there's tensions between performances of masculinities, and there's ways in which some of those kinds of masculinities get, as we've already talked about, valorized or validated, and others get invalidated. Myself as an academic, people may look at me, as an academic, oh my God, he's an intellectual, therefore questioning my identity. Also, and then they're going, and he's a feminist. How could he be a feminist? And oh, is he heterosexual? So I get located and positioned, oftentimes less than other men who may attack or challenge my research, not on the base of its methodologies or the base of its theoretical or conceptual framework, but on the basis of I'm not subscribing to heteronormative masculinity in the narrow, restrictive ways that some men anticipate.
I'm curious, doing this work, have you ever found anything that's really surprised you?
The right answer would be yes. The sad answer is nothing surprises me. I mean,
that's fair. That's fair.
But the sad, the sort of the other side to that is the sad thing. For example, the research I've been doing around adolescent boys in locker rooms is this has been around for a long time. These kinds of tensions, the kinds of homophobic slurs that occur in locker rooms, they were around when I was a teenager, and here we are, fast forward 2018, and schools still leave those locker room spaces unaddressed, and the kind of harassment, the kind of bullying, the kind of stuff that goes on in those locker rooms does so at the expense of the safety of so many young boys who cannot speak up and won't speak up because they would rather withdraw and walk away. So that's kind of the sad story of nothing surprises me. People continue in that case to say, well, what can we do? We can't go in those locker rooms. But the fact of the matter is we can work harder to push back on the culture of masculinity that has allowed for this kind of aggression and allowed for homophobia to occur in our schools. We have responsibilities as teachers, as educators, to help create safe spaces for learning. And clearly here we are, and we haven't been successful in that area. So no, I mean I guess if there's anything, I'm probably contradicting myself. I mean, but anything that surprises me, I think right now, currently in this time frame, is the potential to create some change, building on what so many women have said, particularly around sexual assaults, and the potential. I mean, this for me is a huge surprise, and one which I'm embracing in my talking and in my writing, to say that this needs to be sort of a tide change. This needs to be an opportunity to create this dialogue across men and women, within men and women, across gendered identities, to say we've got to create change now. Because, again, as I mentioned earlier, just to allow it to be back to boys being boys is going to be the worst case scenario.
Yeah, it's definitely time. So something that I love in reading about, some of the writing that's been done around the work that you do is that, and even through the course of this conversation, is that you don't make any secret of having an activist sort of agenda with your research, and you identify that there are changes that you're making moral judgments about, and we have a vision of a place that we want to get to. And I feel like in some circles, when you're talking about academic research and the sort of academia as a whole, that there's this notion that it's supposed to be done in a vacuum. Like, it's a bad thing to have an agenda. It's like we're literally just looking for information, and we're going to talk in very dispassionate academic terms about the information that we find, and that attitude, honestly, is a lot of times what kind of turns me off towards those sorts of academic conversations. And I understand the need for it. Like, obviously, we want to know what the information is, and sometimes if we go in with an agenda, we can taint that information. But I think objectivity is kind of a myth in a lot of ways. And I feel like it maybe in some cases is more valuable to just own, like, well, this is what I'm trying to do. And something that I really like about reading about your work is that you do, you have an agenda, you have goals that you're trying to meet. And so I'm wondering if you can sort of talk about the relationship between that sort of academic research where, you're looking at the facts dispassionately, what is the information, and sort of marrying that with what you're trying to accomplish, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it certainly makes sense. I agree with you. I'm pretty clear in my teaching and in the research questions I ask that I have an agenda, and the agenda is to look deeply and in complex ways about the intersection of masculinities and education. And so my agenda is to broad picture, broad stroke, is to look at issues of equity and social justice. And my agenda is really to examine or raise different questions about the kind of schooling we want to develop in North America, and how do we want our youth to be schooled. And they are being schooled on a day-to-day basis. So I'm pushing back on much more powerful agendas and policies. So the questions I ask purposefully, and the areas, the spaces in which I look, for example, adolescent boys in locker rooms, boys who are readers in schools. I'm looking in certain spaces, and that's all done with purpose and intent. I could be looking at a lot of other spaces, and some people do. Some people look on the playground, and some people will look at certain kinds of groups, and I certainly do that myself. So my earlier research looked specifically, so is a purposeful sampling where I spoke to and hung out with for adolescent boys who rejected the stereotypical ways of being boys. So again, that goes to what you were asking about. Is yes, when we do our research, we're objective, and we want to make sure we're getting at the data, and it has to be authentic data, and we're trying to find student voices. In my case, in my research, and in the same breath. But I am purposely looking at particular kinds of boys and particular kinds of research. For example, ethnographic research, when I hung out with these boys, was a way to get to the nitty-gritty of the day-to-day. Some of the, I mentioned you earlier about looking at men who push back on homophobia within team sports. So a project I'm doing in the UK, in Warwick University, they have the Warwick Rowers, and the Warwick Rowers are actually pushing back on homophobia in team sport, and they've aligned themselves with a nonprofit called Sport Allies. And so in this case, the rowers, who identify as heterosexual males, are actually challenging their own positions of power and privilege, right? So, but I'm very curious about, and I'm doing this purposefully to look at this group of men to see what we can learn from them and what they're doing, so that can be applied more broadly, and possibly it may have some import and utility when we think about other boys in different contexts.
I want to expand on some of this a little bit from my perspective as a budding academic. I am a master's student in psychology currently, and some things that you touched on I think are really important, and I hope that this is relevant to the audience because some of this gets into kind of philosophy of science stuff. But so when you go into a research project, like you mentioned, you specifically look at something that you're interested in. This is something that every single academic does. They have their area or areas of research. You know, they could be researching literally anything. And because they have a specific interest in this area, because they have a specific hypothesis or theory about, you know, why this is occurring or how this is occurring, they focus their research very narrowly on specific phenomenon that are occurring. So when you go into that, there is, I guess you could say, bias or agenda in that, but it's really more of just like a guiding force so that you have somewhere to start. And where you come in, like what your hypothesis is going to be hopefully based on prior research, if there is any prior research, but it's also based on just your observations and your opinion as either an expert or just a person in the world who has observed these things. And then, you know, of course, once you're collecting the data and analyzing the data, you don't want any bias to go into that because that's going to totally mess up everything. And then once you get to the end and you have your results, I think it's really important to highlight the difference between objectivity and neutrality. So let's take, for example, the research that shows that spanking is harmful to children's mental health, which is clear. It's extremely clear. There's tons and tons of studies on it. They all consistently show similar results. If you come out of a study that shows that spanking leads to increased depression in children, you can't, well, you could, but this wouldn't be, I think, being a good scientist. You could say, well, you know, it could be this, it could be this. We're going to be neutral on it. We're not going to take a stand on it. Like, no, we have the answers to the questions that we wanted to know, and now we know what to do going forward. Now we know how to inform, parenting, how to inform policies on whatever, depending on whatever it is that you're looking at. So you want to, it's good to have an agenda in some sense that you want to answer a question, and hopefully you want to be able to apply it to the real world. So once you have the answer to that question, it's not just, oh, well, we answered it, or maybe we didn't, we don't really know.
Maybe I phrased my question badly. When I say agenda, what I think is sort of looked down on as like, when you're doing this stuff, there aren't supposed to be moral judgments in mind. So like to use your example, we find that spanking children leads to an increase in depression, an increase in violent behavior, whatever the results say. Therefore, we make the value judgment that spanking is bad, right? And I think that last leap is what a lot of people push back against.
If you don't want your children to have depression and anger issues and all sorts of other problems, spanking's bad.
Well, right, and it seems obvious, right? But I think that's what happens. And as a layperson, maybe this is just my naivety about the field. Like, you can totally push back on me on that, but when we go into it saying like, okay, yes, I'm a feminist. Yes, I'm pushing back on toxic masculinity. And here's the research I'm doing to that end. I think there are people who would push back on that and saying like, well, you're doing research with a moral or political agenda in mind, as opposed to an agenda of just answering questions, if that makes sense. And I think the fact that that's happening is something that I actually appreciate about this work, and something that I guess some people might push back on, if that makes sense.
I think for all scientists, all researchers, we all have a starting point, and our concerns emerge out of the world around us, right? And and our concerns in terms of, for example, my own schooling experiences may well be informing, the work that I do, or the fact that I was raised by a mother may well be informing or guiding, I think as you said, guiding the kinds of research questions I'm asking. And there's many other researchers who are asking questions alongside mine. And I don't see it as in competition to mine. This isn't about a competition. This is about finding answers to questions that in our day-to-day compel us to wonder and to ask and to rethink what we've always thought, right? And for me, particularly around masculinities and gender and issues of equities, we really do need to be pushed to rethink or question many of the assumptions that we've had for so long, and they've gone unquestioned. So for me, that's compelling. That's challenging because it pushes you to get out of those silos, to get out of those boxes, and to really think hard about why are we so determined to maintain or sustain certain narratives around gendered identities that restrict and limit people in so many ways.
So in one article that I read about what you're trying to do, there was a part where you'd said that to create an open and lasting dialogue, boys and men must not feel like they're under siege or being cast as a uniform group, right? And I agree with that. What I'm interested in is how we balance that concept with honestly naming the problems in our culture surrounding masculinity. And I think about this a lot because, when we're talking about masculinity as a concept, as a social construct, it's really hard, I think, to talk about that without making the folks who fall inside that construct feel like they're being attacked, right? And at some level, we just got to be like, look, we're having this conversation, and it's not necessarily about you as a person. We're talking about this as a concept. And I feel like sometimes we have to sort of balance that, like making people feel as individuals responsible for the sort of social constructs they fall in with, with no fault of their own. But we also don't want to avoid honestly naming these problems surrounding the construct that we have about masculinity. So like, I'd love to hear your thoughts on sort of striking that balance and how we approach the conversation, because what I see, on this podcast where, ostensibly we agree on the things being talked about, and most of the folks listening probably agree, at least mostly in principle, but obviously we do have to have these conversations with people who don't, right? And maybe it's about tailoring our language specifically to sort of softly introduce people to these concepts, and then sort of as we get deeper and deeper, we can be more blunt about it. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on striking that balance in these conversations.
Can I just say I agree with everything you just said?
Man, it's a real SJW circle jerk in here.
Isn't that the truth? It's difficult. On the one hand, what we need to do is create an open, respectful dialogue that invites all boys and men to the conversation, and in the same breath, I agree. We need to name certain kinds of masculinity as troubling and damaging, and we need to identify and specifically explain why certain kinds of masculinities are not healthy, and why certain kinds of masculinities do perpetuate and maintain very hurtful, harmful ways of being men, not only to other men, but across gendered identities. And so explicitly naming those kinds of masculinities is important. And for men who may say, I feel I'm under attack, is this all about me? I think we as men need to look hard at what part of this do do you feel is positioning you as being under attack? Where is the discomfort coming from? Because there's been a long narrative of discomfort that we've not been able to speak loudly or publicly about. So I guess I'm just cautious about who are we protecting in these conversations, and if there is some sense of ownership for complacency and contributing to damaging and violent masculinity, then I think we need to step back and say, how and in what ways have I perpetuated, maintained those restrictive norms? And in doing so, I think we become more honest with the kind of power dynamics that we've contributed to, the kind of gendered relations that we've contributed to on a regular basis. So I'm doing this dance between, yes, I want to engage and invite conversation across masculinities and femininities. In the same breath, I think we do need to be honest and authentic about where issues are emerging and have been historically, because this is not new. Some of the behaviors and attitudes have a very long narrative, and so for certain forms of masculinity to come under greater scrutiny recently, well, so be it, because we need to really take this and look hard at what we've known for far too long, but not been able to do anything to push back on because of the power of patriarchy and because of the stranglehold that patriarchy has had over gendered identities in our society. So I hope I've answered the question. I try to think about, yes, we need to engage an open dialogue, and the notion about men under siege. I don't deny, I think some men do feel that they're under attack, but I also am just very cautious and careful about veering away from the conversation because of the discomfort. Bell Hooks says that discomfort can be a powerful space in which we learn about power arrangements, and I agree. I think we need to take that up as a positive, even though uncomfortable space in which to learn about how we wield power.
So I'd probably be remiss if I didn't bring up, obviously there's been a lot of conversation about the violence that exists, specifically, the culture in the U.S. and the sorts of ties between traditional notions of masculinity and the culture of violence that we have here. And that's, that connection with the seemingly endless parade of mass shootings that we have. And part of me thinks that it's a little bit of a red herring because we only talk about mass shootings and we don't talk about the individual, gun violence that happens literally every single day. Like none of that makes the news. But I do think it's important that we have those kinds of conversations. And I've seen lots of writing about the sort of culture of toxic masculinity and its connection with this sort of violence. Do you have any thoughts on the connections there?
I would say that I think we need to be very careful about how we link masculinity to the singularity of masculinity and violence, gun violence in particular, and school shootings. I think there's also the complication, oftentimes, who's shooting, racialized identities get thrown in there, and I think misunderstood. We rarely hear about white man goes out shooting. It's usually racialized incorrectly in the sense that we forget about whiteness, and so whiteness becomes an invisible construct. And so I think in terms of the violence and in terms of our culture and North American culture, I think it's largely around how violence gets played out in the day-to-day and the ways in which we see the expression of violent masculinities, and essentially it goes to the core of why our people striking out in the ways in which they do. And I think you can say, what are we giving people license to do when we create such divisions, be they raced, classed, gendered, and these silos get created and maintained, and they get politicized, and that gets carried forward and actually fuels the fire for some people to think that it's legitimate to strike out and be violent against people who are unlike them and the othering process. And so I think therein lies part of the difficulty and the challenges in our day-to-day is, so are these legitimate divisions, or are these divisions that we've created to protect our own rights and needs at the expense of others?
See, what I was going to suggest to solve this problem was going to be to make gender illegal, but it seems like what you're saying is that's not a good idea because some people would get mad.
Yes, gender illegal.
I'm telling you, everything that you said
here.
has just bolstered my agenda to ban gender. My agender, I suppose you could call it. But
You're oh my God, Ari. So, lots of these conversations leave me, I'm going to be honest, feeling pretty cynical about the whole thing. And I guess if I have a reputation at all, it's as largely like a positive and affirmative and hopeful and optimistic person. But I often don't feel that way, and especially around issues, surrounding gender and that kind of stuff. And you look at our society, and so many people have so much emotional investment in these traditional gender roles, right? Like, I'm a man, I got my guns and my country music and my like gross cheap beer, and like that's who I am as a person. Like, and in so much of their identity is not wrapped up in masculinity as a whole, but like that specific brand of masculinity where, you're tough and you're emotionless and those kinds of things. And it leaves me feeling not super optimistic about the possibility of successfully challenging and changing those notions and those concepts and sort of disabusing people of the value of those concepts. Do you have hope that there is hope for success like changing these norms?
I'm incredibly optimistic, incredibly enthusiastic, particularly since coming out here, taking up this new research professorship at the University of Calgary at the Workland School of Education. I've been overwhelmed by support here to do the work that I'm doing. There's lots of agencies here around the prevention of violence against women, around YWCA, around sexual assault centers. There's lots of conversations going on here, and I'm really quite heartened by the number of people who are really interested in thinking about masculinities in the plural and thinking about ways that we can change the channel to open up the dialogue. And it's striking for me, particularly with all the assumptions and stereotypes about Calgary and cowboys and tough men drinking beer and getting on their horses. I'm really quite struck by those stereotypes that I'm not finding out here. And so there are certainly, and I'm not talking just within the academic ivory tower. I'm talking in the community, across agencies, at the Calgary Board of Education, and the willingness to talk about gay-straight alliances. And I mean, I've been out to a number of schools very recently and really been engaged with different teachers who are talking to me about how they're really inviting students in, and it's very inclusive. So there is, for me, a lot of optimism. There is a lot of, I think, willingness to change the conversation, willingness to open up the dialogue. And I think even I have a guest speaker coming from Australia from March 1st, Andrea Walling, and she is talking about the circulation of dick pics through social media. And I think even that kind of dialogue publicly would probably not have happened 5 or 10 years ago here at the Workland School of Education. I think that's a real sign about the forward thinking and the possibilities for creating change. And for me, it's about nurturing change agents and being much more inclusive and acknowledging the diversity of masculinities and femininities.
Well, to be fair, you also live in a country where you can be thrown in prison for misgendering someone, so watch your back. That's all I'm saying. What's that other Canadian gender academic guy? It's like Joran A. Peters or something like that. I can't quite.
Oh my God. They, them, we. I'm sorry. That's in Ontario.
Yeah.
Oh, Ontario exclusive. Okay. I thought it was all of Canada.
Right. You do know, like, another country isn't a monolith, Ari. Is that another conversation we're going to have here?
Something that's not America. I don't know.
Oh, my God. Okay, we're done. So is there anywhere on the web that we can go to learn more about your research, more about your work, any videos we can watch, any resources, anything like that you can give us?
Yeah, definitely. You can go to the Workland School of Education at the University of Calgary, and you could Google my name, Michael Keeler, Kehler, and it will take you to the Workland School of Education. And that's where you'll see there's actually some recordings there and me talking about my research as well as articles. And we're actually uploading as well some of our speakers who we've currently had from the UK and this week from Australia. And in a month's time, fellow Joseph Nelson, who's coming from the US, from Swarthmore College. He'll be here talking about Black masculinities. And then that's where you'll find a lot more research about what I'm doing and about the kind of work that's going on here.
Very cool. I will put all of that in the show notes for folks to check out. Dr. Keeler, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for the work that you're doing, and thanks for hanging out with us.
Thanks for putting up with my crappy jokes.
Thank you, both of you.
And that, my friends, is going to do it for this episode of the Gaytheist Manifesto. We are a proud member of the Trans Podcaster Visibility Initiative. We're a group of trans podcasting badasses working to bring more trans voices into podcasting and other content creation. Search for the Trans Podcaster Visibility Initiative on Facebook for more info. You can find the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto. You can email us at podcast@thegaytheistmanifesto.com. I'm on Twitter at GaytheistCallie. You can find the show on Twitter at The Gaytheists. And given the conversation that we just had, Ari, your outro better be awesome.
Well, Callie, sometimes we do our best and we just don't succeed. You know, we get up, we try our hardest at everything. We put everything we have into it, 110%, going at it with gusto, and it just doesn't work out like we want it to. Like the other day when I was editing audio for Reasonable Risk and I had put 2.5 hours into it, and then Audacity corrupted my file and deleted everything, and there wasn't anything I could do about it, and I had to start over. So, you know, sometimes things just don't go our way, and that's part of being human. And really, what I'm trying to say is I didn't really write an outro. So, so if you want to feel like a failure alongside with me, you can listen to me on the SJW Circle Jerk, on the Sister Getting Out of Hand. Email me, aristillman4@gmail.com, and you can see all my self-loathing postings on Facebook, where you can also see me griping about how Audacity fucked me over.
You didn't write an outro, and it still managed to be a good outro. You're a hero. You're a hero, Ari. The hero Gaytheist needs, not the one it deserves.
They wrote that song about me. You know, we are the champions. The we was actually me, because I'm a plural person.
Well, because they is a plural pronoun by nature, obviously.
Yeah.
So, that's obvious.
It's also like the royal we. Yeah. It's the same thing.
If you want to support the show and the activism we do, you can head to patreon.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto and make a per episode donation as little as $1 per episode. And if you can't do that, you can head over to iTunes, give us a 5-star review. That helps us move up in the rankings and get heard by more people. Before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, knows that you're capable of amazing things, and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto.